Good morning. Really wonderful to see so many of you out on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and I know you're anxious to hear our speaker this morning, and so I'll begin. My name is Pat Parody, and I am the Executive Director of the Centre for Constitutional Studies here at the University of Alberta. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Parkland Institute, very fortunately a board director for this organization, which does such amazing work. And so I have the privilege this morning of introducing our first speaker, and his name is Andrew Cash. Andrew is the co-founder of the Urban Worker Project, a national initiative aimed at building a stronger voice and better conditions for freelance, on-contract, self-employed, and part-time workers in Canada. And having been one of those workers for many years, I'm happy to see that this organization exists. As a member of Parliament, he tabled groundbreaking legislation. He was a member of Parliament between 2011 and 2015. Groundbreaking legislation dealing with precarious work, which led to first-time protections for unpaid interns under federal labor laws. And as we all know, and in particular at the university, many of us know there is a tremendous amount of precariat work here and everywhere, increasingly. Prior to politics, Andrew worked as a freelance writer, covering a broad range of social, political, and environmental issues for Now magazine. And interestingly, Andrew is also a Juno and SOCAN award-winning musician and composer with over a dozen albums to his credit. I understand he doesn't do as much of that these days because of his work with the Urban Worker Project. He lives in Toronto with his wife and 4 children, and I'm very pleased to present him. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to questions.
All right. Thank you, Pat, for that introduction. Good morning. How's everybody doing? You didn't party too much last night? No. The ones that did, obviously, aren't here right now. So just a little bit about the Urban Worker Project, just to begin. It's a national nonprofit that I co-founded with my colleague Stephanie Nikitsis about 1.5 years ago to raise the issues and the voices of people working in what we have normally thought of as traditional, those who are not in what we normally think of as traditional employee-employer relationships. So that's freelancers on contract, solo self-employed, contingent, temp, part-time, unpaid workers, including those in the so-called gig economy. So the project has 3 main goals. Firstly, to raise the issues and the voices of people working this way, independent workers, and to get their issues into the public debate that we're having right now about work, so that we begin to see some of these work issues through the lens of independent workers, those who are not in a conventional employee-employer relationship. Secondly, we're striving to build community and connection between independent workers themselves. If you're an independent worker, you're oftentimes working alone, you're isolated, you have very little support of any kind. And even if you are working on contract in and amongst other workers in an organization or in an office, you're oftentimes outside of the main frame of that workplace culture. And then finally, and most importantly, we're working to organize issue-based campaigns that target policy and legislative initiatives that can make work better for independent workers and for all workers. Now, indeed, the majority of new jobs in the Canadian economy are in this category: part-time, temporary, on-contract, freelance, solo, self-employed. In the arts and culture, in the tech, knowledge, not-for-profit, and service sectors, this is the new normal. However, we are seeing increasingly this shift to a temporary, contingent workforce across all sectors, in all professions, and among all private and public sector employers. And regardless of the demographic and the socioeconomic silos we collect in, more and more of us are finding we share a common reality. Too many of us are a bike accident away from the financial abyss. It takes one bicycle accident, one small calamity to change too many workers' lives. No workplace pension, no benefits, no job security, no disability or sick leave, no recourse when we're being ripped off, and largely, but not totally, but largely no collective voice. These jobs fall outside of most provincial labor laws and standards. Discrimination, racism, sexual harassment, unsafe working conditions, contract non-payment, unpredictable scheduling, and unpaid work are all common realities for indie workers, and we hear these stories every week at the Urban Worker Project. And speaking of stories, I'm reminded of this one, and I don't know, those of you who are from Edmonton may remember the story of Edmontonian Andy Ferguson. And his story, his tragic story, underlines the massive gaps in our protections for workers today, our protections for independent workers today. Andy died in a head-on collision on November 1st, 2011, after working back-to-back night shifts at a local radio station here as part of a practicum through the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. He worked 16 of his last 24 hours at the radio station, culminating in a graveyard shift, and it literally was the graveyard shift. It was a Halloween special the radio station was doing, and they made him work at a graveyard that night for some reason. He drove home at 5 a.m. on November 1st and fell asleep at the wheel and was killed in a head-on collision. Now, his family, his family wanted answers. They also wanted to understand what recourse they had and what protections, what ways in which Andy was supposed to have been protected under the law, and they sought answers. And the initial response they got from the Federal Human Resources Ministry was in part, and this is part of the letter that his family received, in order to be protected under labor standards provisions, an employer-employee relationship needs to exist, and it is not the case for practicum students. This is, a striking example of how important the legal definition of employee is. It's sometimes a matter of life and death. And I just add here that this is the case for millions of Canadian workers, and we'll get to the numbers in a little bit. And to make matters worse, while the radio station, being a federally regulated organization, was under federal labor laws, his practicum with NAIT fell under provincial labor laws. So his family got into a situation where neither order of government wanted to take any responsibility for anything that happened with Andy. So his story inspired a bill that I co-sponsored in the House of Commons called the Intern Protection Act, which and the goal of that was to tighten these rules around interns. And it was quite a sweeping bill, and this was during the Harper years, and we didn't expect much, although we knew that, given the fact that the Conservatives had so many seats in Alberta, that there might be a chance of moving this issue, and indeed there was, because while they voted down the bill, they subsequently adopted several of the measures in the bill, and it led to the first protections under Canada's labor laws for unpaid interns, which have been increased now under the current government. Until recently, indie workers occupied a very small corner of the labor market. So if you think back 30 years, 35 years, people who worked freelance were often, the kind of ne'er-do-well types, right? Those sort of rebels who didn't want to do the 9 to 5, didn't want to work for the man, and so it was easy at that point for government, for academia, for labor, for the media, for policymakers generally, to ignore this group because they were just tiny and they were kind of annoying anyway. But that's not the case today. And while they may still seem invisible to the eye trained to view work within the context of the post-depression welfare state, today, independent workers are everywhere. Indie workers work from their kitchen table, from co-working spaces, from studios and coffee shops, on public transit and in public libraries, in offices alongside permanent employees of large for-profit companies and government bureaucracies. They work for tiny NGOs, large crown corporations. They work for churches and unions. They are students, they're caregivers, they're parents, they're volunteers, they're commuters. They work in hospitals, universities, newsrooms, and bars. They cut our hair, they fix our leaky roof, they walk our dogs, they look after our seniors, they tutor our children, and they drive us to the airport. They work on Sundays, they work on stat holidays, they work when others play, they work when they have the flu and they should be in bed, they work when they're on chemo. And when they take a week's holiday, well, that's a week they just simply don't get paid. They act as unpaid tax collectors for federal and provincial governments and are responsible for paying both the employer and the employee share of their CPP. And as you walk by a coffee shop, or a co-working space, it may be tempting to think, well, look at all those mostly young people in there with their cool laptops and their groovy haircuts. They're doing okay. They don't need our help. But what you won't see, what is invisible, is the largely low-wage contract they're probably working on their computer there. The fact that they haven't been paid for the last gig and they may not get paid for months for this one. You won't see the stress of always working alone and independently. You certainly wouldn't have seen the stress Andy Ferguson was going through as he tried to tell that radio station he was too tired to work another night shift. In fact, there was texts between him and his girlfriend that very day about how upset he was. In fact, he said that the radio station said they wouldn't sign off on his practicum if he didn't come in and work that night. You won't see that stress. You won't see the stress of always working alone and independently outside of a workplace culture without access to mentors, colleagues, career guidance. You won't see, you won't see untreated mental health problems, dental problems. You also won't see the massive student debt hanging over most, especially young workers. You won't see the expensive and unstable housing that they live in or the struggles they have to find affordable childcare for their own young children. You also won't see that many of the parents and family members of independent workers are themselves working in low-waged, precarious work. And you can put indie workers into two broad categories, and it's important that we make this distinction. One's indie by choice, and the other is indie by chance. It's important to note that of the roughly 8,000 independent workers that have connected to the Urban Worker Project, many say they love the work they do. They like to work this way. But they say as well, hey, just because I like to work this way doesn't mean I like how unstable and precarious it is, and I don't think it has to be that way. Those are the ones in the indie by choice category. And the indie by, but more and more workers are in the indie by chance category, and there's many reasons for that. Where if they're given a choice between the instability and the complications of a freelance career and a stable full-time job with a pension and benefits, access to skills, training, and job promotional opportunities, a coffee machine and a fast internet connection, well, they're going to choose the stable full-time job. They absolutely will. So you have to remember that the next time you hear the new apostles of neoliberalism 3.0 tell you how millennials love working several low-paying jobs at the same time because, they like the choice and the flexibility and it fits into their lifestyle. Come on. Well, I guess actually, if you're living in poverty, maybe 4 low-paying part-time jobs do fit into your lifestyle. Just think on that one for a second. Because that's really what they're saying. Many indie workers are awakening to the fact that under the current system, they have very little recourse, very few rights, and almost no support. For many, though, it comes as a complete shock because most people work under the assumption that they have rights and that those rights are protected under law until that is tested. If you're working in say, for example, the screen-based sector, film and television, you're used to the understanding that you have very little rights or protections. But even there, people are beginning to get increasingly concerned, outraged, and angered by the situation. But I wanted to just show you a couple letters that we've received recently from different types of workers and how this realization of their lack of protection plays on them. This is a letter we received just a couple months ago. Yes, right. So I've been in a series of 3-month contracts with the same company for a year. So right away, there's a red flag there, right? I would say, okay, are you really a contract worker or are you actually an employee of that company, right? So there's a flag. Payment of invoices has dramatically slowed down. I'm currently waiting for payment of invoices dating back over 3 months. What is the legal length of time a company has to pay invoices, and do I have any recourse? And of course, the answer is, well, yeah, you do. It's called small claims court, which is really like saying, no, you don't have any recourse. There's little stopping. And a client, now remember, and we're going to get to the numbers, but it's roughly between 4 and 6 million Canadian workers work this way, and their employer or the client has no real reason to pay them on time. There's no legal compulsion to make that happen. So we're operating in a zone of the honor system, and we know what happens when we work in that zone between employers and employees, even with the best intentions. Now, this is another one that just arrived, actually just before I got on the plane to come out west. And I would put this person in the indie by chance category. That was the subject header in the email, Generation Screwed. And I didn't put it up on the slide, but he says that his employer eliminated his position 2 weeks before his probation was to expire. This was done for 2 reasons: to make me ineligible for severance and to cut assigned hours. And then he said his employer before that changed his schedule so much that he didn't have enough hours to qualify for the company benefits. Okay? This is why Generation Screwed is where they find themselves today. We today have whole segments of the population who are societal nomads with a feeling of disempowerment and a lack of purpose. How can the boomers expect to retain every aspect of their posh existence while Generation Screwed are sustaining themselves by withdrawals from the bank of mom and dad and enchained by massive student debt and paralyzed by precarious employment? If you do nothing as a result of reading this today, you are part of the problem. Now, this language is starkly different from that which is used, by the apostles of neoliberalism 3.0. Theirs is calculated to put a new tech-sexy spin on the crappy job. The gig economy, the idea that people work this way as a lifestyle choice. The media cacophony about mobile platforms all try to mask decades of wage stagnation, the staggering decline in available full-time employment, and the increasing income inequality which has embedded itself in our society. Maybe that's why sometimes governments and the media double down on the fantasy economy, extolling the exciting opportunities of the gig economy while allowing a company like Sears to hang thousands of faithful employees out to dry and obscuring the dissent in bafflegab worthy of Orwell. And I just want to give you a little example of that bafflegab. This was the headline that the Globe Mail ran just after StatsCan released their August jobs numbers. Canada's job gains beat expectations in August. I'm just going to read the first sentence. For some reason I didn't put up on the slide, but the first sentence reads, "Younger and full-time workers were left behind last month as Canada's unemployment rate slid to 6.2% in August." Okay, so the title is Canada's job gains beat expectations in August. The first sentence is, young and full-time workers were left behind last month, which means that the expectations in August must have been pretty damn low. The addition of 22,000 jobs last month helped notch the country's unemployment rate down to the same level as October 2008. While the results of StatsCan's monthly labor force survey are volatile at best, the most recent edition found that 110,400 part-time jobs were created, but that was weighed down by the loss of 88,100 full-time jobs. I don't know if you remember this, but it was met with much self-congratulation among government and the media, as though this false apples-to-apples comparison was something to celebrate. Now, to be fair, the following month, StatsCan reported the mere opposite activity, with new full-time jobs outpacing part-time work. And in fact, that trend has continued throughout the latter part of 2017. But what isn't clear in any of that is what's the quality of these full-time jobs that are being created? Do they come with a pension, benefits, job security? Are they minimum wage jobs that are going to result in what the Generation Screwed dude experience, which is, working right up until his probationary period is over? Are these career anchoring jobs, especially for young people, where they could imagine starting a life, building a family, maybe buying a house, or at least renting a decent apartment near where the job is? And it's why I think we need a new way of counting, a new way of looking at jobs, a new jobs quality index, so that it's not just about the raw numbers, but the index is weighted by other qualitative factors. And speaking of numbers, it is difficult to say exactly how many indie workers we have in Canada, but hard numbers do help paint a picture. StatsCan, okay, and forgive me because I think the next panel, it doesn't have everything I wanted on it, but anyway, that's the 2016 self-employment numbers from StatsCan. But due to the rapidly changing nature of work and the way workers move from conventional to non-standard work in a given month, in a given week, in a given day, it's very hard to nail this down, and likely, and we'll see other numbers, likely this number is much larger. 2013 United Way McMaster study, the PEPSO report, found that in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, 50% of all workers did not have full-time jobs. And so that's a region of 6 million people. We have some private sector studies as well, one done by business and financial software company Intuit, predict freelancers, independent contractors, and on-demand workers will make up 45% of the Canadian workforce by 2020. And Deloitte just has published a series of studies here in 2017, one entitled Global Human Capital Trends, which found that 6.1 million workers in Canada in 2015 are contingent workers. And the way we describe this, people choose different descriptors, and that I've landed on independent work as a catch-all for all of this. Some, as Deloitte's calling these type of workers contingent workers. Data out of the U.S. also can give us a clue as to the potential size here in Canada. According to the American Freelancers Union, there's about 53 million American workers working like this. It's about 34% of the workforce, and the expectations among most analysts in the United States is that number is going to ramp up to 50% of all workers in the United States by 2020 will be working in non-standard employee-employer relationships. In fact, data out of the U.S. shows that between 2005 and 2015, about 90% of the net job growth in the United States is in this broad bucket of work. But no matter what kind of statistical contortions we put ourselves through, the evaporation of the full-time job as we've come to know it is real. It is upon us right now. And I mean, I'm not the expert on why that's happened, and I know there's probably many people in this room who are, but we know that the ferocious nexus of globalization, automation, and close to 40 years of laissez-faire neoliberal governments has created this reality that we see today. In Ontario, for example, and many of you are probably watching this, this strike we have among Ontario college teachers, but 80% of college teaching in Ontario is taught by contract faculty, that is part-time itinerant contractors. You go into any Home Depot or large grocery store and just ask the cashier, so do you work full-time? I do this all the time. So do you work full-time? No, I have part-time. Does anyone work full-time? No, nobody does. Now I'm quoting here an article from the Atlantic Monthly. It's the August 2015 Atlantic. This is just to put in context the evaporation of the full-time job. 1964, the most valued company in the United States, AT&T, was worth $267 billion in 2015 dollars. It employed 758,611 people. Google, in 2015, is worth $100 billion more than AT&T and employs 55,000 people. Another small thing, well, not small, big thing, is that in 1964, the population of the United States was 192 million. In 2015, the population of the U.S. was 320 million, exacerbating that statistic. And so when you can't find that job, and increasingly those jobs just are not there to find, you have to start making up your own. And so I want to introduce you to a few people who have done just that. So when I first met Joan, she just moved to Toronto from a small town. She just finished her degree at art school, and she was working for a community newspaper, which is pretty cool. That meant she was working on her laptop on her tiny kitchen table in her even tinier apartment, doing graphic design for that community paper on a part-time basis. She loves the work she does, and she's been trying. She was trying for years to land a full-time job. I do want to report that she actually did find one. So full disclosure, she is now actually part of the conventional employee-employer stream. But what she wanted to say, and what she said to us, is that for her, decent work would mean, in the context of her, when she's an independent worker, decent work for her means broadening who is covered under under the Employment Standards Act, so that she could begin to access some of the rights and supports enjoyed by those with full-time stable employment. So Annabel is so he's like a construction worker, and now he's doing props for film and television, and he's started a little bike shop as well. And so he's working with his hands. His work is physical. He doesn't have any disability. He's had one job in his entire life where he's been able to access extended benefits, and that was just for 3 months. So, and again, he likes what he does. But for him, decent work would mean access to income security protection when he's between those gigs as a prop builder or a construction worker, and some kind of protection in case he does have an accident at work. Currently, he has no protection. Now, Samantha has 2 elementary school-aged children, I think in like grade 6 and 4. She's a single mom. She rents an apartment in an expensive, in Toronto, it's expensive there. And, she likes the work she does too. She's a house cleaner. She has her own clients. She has some flexibility. And the reason she needs that flexibility is because she can't afford childcare. It's completely out of the question for her. And this is the kind of work that she was able to glom onto in order to stand the best chance to spend the most time raising her kids. So she has no pension. That's one of the things that is really gnawing on her. And finally, and I don't have a picture of Mira, but I wanted to introduce you to Mira as well, because her story gives you a real sense of how complicated it is for independent workers to construct their own social safety net. Mira is an occupational therapist. She has a master's. She could not find a job. She could not find a job as an occupational therapist. So she started to build her own client base and started her own business. She didn't want to do that. That was not in the cards for her, but that's what she did. And then her and her partner wanted to have a kid, and he's an independent worker as well. So they had to plan this methodically, and they saved up enough money for her to take a year of mat leave. So that's the financial part of the mat leave. But she also had to find somebody to take over her clients. And that person had to agree to give those clients back to her when she got back off mat leave. So that was incredibly complicated, and it blew my mind that she was able to pull it off. But these are the kinds of resourcefulness and planning that a generation ago would have been unheard of, especially for an occupational therapist. And while work has changed, most of our labor laws and policies remain rooted in an era predicated on full-time, stable employment, the 9-to-5 job. Current policy work and proposed legislation, like, for example, that which resulted from a broad review of Ontario's labor laws and standards, is focused largely on, and I absolutely applaud and think this is so vitally important. A lot of that work lands on trying to make bad bosses better, right? Make bad bosses better so they treat their workers better. But what we're dealing with here is a huge group of people who don't really have a boss in the traditional sense, certainly not in the legal sense. Indie workers, as well as many conventional workers, doubt they will ever have a workplace pension or be able to retire at all. I mean, we have people connected to our project who say things like, I'm investing in my health because that's my pension plan. As long as I'm healthy, I can work, and I'll have to work because I'll never have a pension. Fewer workers consider a full-time stable job as a likely outcome of all their training and expensive education. And an unsurprising outcome that we may see down the road to that very fact is a decline in enrollment in post-secondary institutions that are so expensive for young people. In fact, I was talking to a group of young people who just graduated from SFU, and they were all saying, the common thing we all say is, I just graduated, so time to become a barista. The new reality of work requires new thinking about how we support workers. First, it requires us to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to look for ways to support workers in the work reality that they're facing right now, while at the same time pushing back against the egregious effects of globalization that brought us to this point in the first place. Something indie workers need: laws to stop contract non-payment and to protect contract workers. We need to expand the definition of employee so contract workers can begin to access the same rights and benefits as standard employees. We need tax changes to allow for income averaging, portable benefits for pension and health and dental for independent workers. We need to expand our universal health care system to include pharma and dental care. We also need to greatly expand our EI system so it becomes something all workers can count on when they need it. I think we need to make parental leave a universal benefit and take it out of EI so that all people who need parental leave can access it. Independent workers need access to career and skills training. We need to start thinking in more innovative ways about how we provide sick leave for independent workers. I mean, I absolutely support the focused attention that provincial governments are now placing on ensuring that employers follow the law and make available sick leave for their workers. We are not at a place yet where we're talking about, okay, so how do I do this for the 6 million independent workers in Canada who also need a sick day once in a while? I've already mentioned, I think we need a new job quality index that measures not just the numbers, but what kinds of jobs are being created. Are they full-time? Do they have a pension? Do they have benefits? Counting. We need better counting. We need better data. Generally, our data around this issue is incomplete and cumbersome when it comes to how people work, who's working, and how much work is being done for no pay. Universities and colleges don't necessarily know how their student population works, how many of them work. Cities don't count independent workers, so are unable to plan accordingly. Provinces and the federal government don't know how their citizens work, how many are working independently, how many are working for free, who they are, and where they are. They do know how many people are working, they just don't know how these people are working. Provincial enforcement of existing labor laws is usually woefully inadequate and needs to be enhanced. So it's one thing, as the Ontario government has done, it's one thing to overhaul and to completely, really do a serious deep dive into your labor laws and standards. It's another thing to walk the talk and to enforce those laws, and that's a big part of this. And finally, public sector employers must be model employers. Federal, provincial, and municipal governments and all of their tangential agencies, universities, hospitals, libraries, crown corporations, they need policies around their own labor practices that need to be codified within the context of being model employers. If they're not going to do it, private sector's not going to do it. You know, I don't think this is all gloom and doom, and the work that we do with our cohort, so many, especially young people, are excited and hopeful and optimistic about their times. I think that's really important to underline all the time, because we can get pretty gloom and doomy about all this. But at the same time, you know, and I believe that the current context means we do have incredible opportunities to bridge some of the socioeconomic silos that we collect in. I think the rise of unstable work means a taxi driver and the fare have more in common with each other than they've ever had before. I think that's an opportunity. Unionized labor in both the private and public sector have opportunities to reach beyond their existing membership and imagine new alliances and new ways of serving the new working class. Just as the issues and the context is different, the solutions that will help make work better today and tomorrow likely won't look like the solutions we arrived at after the Great Depression. So that's it. Work has changed. Let's make it work for us. Thanks. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Andrew. And so I guess we'll begin with questions. Does anyone, John, just can you wait, John, for a mic? Can you see John? He's just in the middle here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Just a couple of comments. The first is that even the gig economy has access to the Canada Pension Plan, which is one of the good reasons for expanding it, and that would include disability benefits. And the second is that the Gypsy academic has been a fact of university life for, I would guess, at least 40 years. In spite of the fact that most universities have mottos in Latin, usually, proclaiming their commitment to high moral standards.
I guess I can respond to your comments with comments. Is that okay? You know, we have, it just reminds me of a story of a woman that is connected to our project, who is a contract instructor at a university. And she said, you know, one day I just decided I was going to tell my students how much I was getting paid. And she said two students came up to her after the class to say that they made more than she did working 3 nights a week at a restaurant. And, you know, yeah, so I'm just going to leave that one at that. And as far as CPP goes, you know, I'm absolutely was thrilled to see the expansion of CPP. But CPP is not going to be enough for workers to retire on when they don't have a workplace pension. It just absolutely won't be. And I don't know a single person who is relying on that at this point in their lives, you know.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. I'm one of those precarious workers at Athabasca University. How many people have taken a course at Athabasca University or know anything about it? Yeah, you may or may not know the majority of the teaching is done by precarious workers. I mean, we do have some job security. We are organizing CUPE. We managed to win benefits after a drastic situation of demonstrating why we needed them. We have a minor RSP. The big thing, though, is our university is not a model employer, despite the appearances of a new president. But there's no protection for people where they're trying to force our members into a call center model, which some of you have heard about before, where people with PhDs, professional psychologists, you know, people somewhat qualified, have to bill for every minute of their work. Now it's becoming even more apparent why the university does it, because it's their advantage to have that kind of precarious workforce where they can give us students or not give us students as needed without any commitment to long-term employment or any kind of level of pay. So it's expected.
Excuse me, could we have your question,
Sorry.
please?
Anyway, so I just wanted to say this is an example. So the dilemma is, how do you put pressure on universities with a neoliberal corporate kind of regime where they have no commitment to good employment practices?
Well, I mean, even though we're in a new era of work, the same kind, the same ways that pressure is always applied on employers still works today. And the struggles and the challenges of applying that pressure are still the same as they ever were. And they require a lot of sacrifice. Just say, ask all the contract teachers that are on strike right now in Ontario. But I also know, I'm also being told from some of my friends in academia that in some universities they are starting to notice a drop in enrollment, a drop in post-grad enrollment, and I think those, that drop it's not just about the price of post-secondary education when you look at what you can get in the job market after you get a degree. It's also around the quality of the education they're getting. And this is one of the things that's been talked about a lot in the Ontario strike, is that, you can't follow up with an instructor who may not, because like 3 months in the, the next semester, that instructor's maybe not even there anymore. So anyway, that's it's pressure. That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
Would those of you who want to ask questions, please raise your hands just so I can get a look. Yeah.
Hi. So a lot of these precarious workers, indie workers, they straddle the line of what Marx would call the petty bourgeoisie. And seeing that a lot of them have owned their own means of production on an individual basis, you would think that this is a Marxist and an anarchist dream to go and seize the means of collectively the means of production. So why is it that we find we are reverting back to same old of going to government, begging for loose change, when we have an opportunity to build workers' collectives and workers' cooperatives?
I totally agree. We have a huge opportunity to do that. And I think as well, tech can play a very important part in leveraging this moment too. So on the one hand, we see that right now, tech is being used to essentially break apart the whole employee-employer contract. It could also be used as a way. The big challenge in a frizzled workplace is that it's hard to connect, it's hard to collect, it's hard to make contact. The way unions have traditionally organized are predicated on people working in a certain physical place, and the steps that you take to form a bargaining unit mean that if the workplace changes over every 3 months, you're going to have different names on the list by the time you get to the board. So there are opportunities, and I think there are organizations out there, and I suspect, because I've seen some of the speakers who are at this conference, I suspect there's some of that conversation happening here, and I think it's exciting, for sure.
Thank you so much for this wake-up call, although I was already fully awake. I want to talk, no, I don't want to talk, I want to ask, what about this idiotic debate we have about tipping restaurant workers, yes or no, and what is this tipping anyhow? And the other one is Uber. Can you talk about this so-called new pickup service that delivers us to the airport and what is behind that. And then this other one called Skip the Dishes. Who makes the money? Because apparently it's not the people who do the hard work. It is an outrageous thing. And I would like you to comment on that so that I stop my madness. No, I like to stay mad anyhow.
All right. So it was tipping Uber and Skip the Dishes. Okay, so I mean, if you're referring to a specific Alberta scenario, are you just talking about tipping in general in restaurants, and what's the deal with that?
That was the overall.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for some interesting reason, across most provinces, certain industries get carve-outs and exceptions from employment standards rules, and the hospitality industry has been one of those sectors. And again, this is ripe for abuse, and yet, there's very few jobs out there for young people where you can make more than $11.50 an hour. And so what's happened here is, you can work in a bar or a restaurant, and when you factor in your tips, you're probably making $20 to $30 an hour. And I would bet there's not a lot of $20 to $30 an hour jobs out there right now. I mean, I know Alberta, there are those jobs, but some of those jobs are still here. But for most of the country, that's not the case. So I think personally, I think employers should all be having to pay at least the minimum wage. I don't understand how sectors like the restaurant business don't have to do that. But at the same time, if you ask servers if they would rather get paid $15 an hour or $11 an hour and get tips, I think they're going to say they'd prefer to keep it at 11 as long as they can keep their tips. That's, I think, what they'd say. So with Uber, I mean, I don't know what the debate's been like here in Edmonton, but in Toronto, I can tell you this, that all of a sudden, with the arrival of Uber, suddenly, the taxi industry was this beacon of worker rights. And I think I'm just going to leave it at that. But you are ahead of me on the skip the dishes thing. I don't know what that is. So you're cutting edge.
For myself, it's a dirty operation that promises jobs. Now, from what I have found out is that these workers, and they are quite often migrant workers or refugees, one refugee man whom we are sponsoring, and they have to buy their own delivery bags, they have to come there with the car, they have to have the driver's license and all that, and then they bring the meals to you. So the employer only pays $2 or $3 for each delivery. $2 or $3. Mm-hmm. In my madness, I forget that number.
Yeah.
I believe it's probably $3. And the rest has to come from the so-called tipping at the door. And apparently, there are many people who are not very generous, so they don't tip at all. So these people are just, running for this so-called operation. Skip the dishes.
Yeah. Well, and skip the dishes sounds like many of the tech platforms for work today, which are really basically virtual temp agencies, where you can't define the employer, but this anonymous entity, whether it's Uber or TaskRabbit or many of these other ones, are actually making the money, and you're there as an independent contractor with very little, with next to no rights. So all the responsibilities have been loaded onto the worker, and that's the reality for independent workers today.
Thank you so much. A policy prescription that seems to have reemerged in recent years is the notion of a guaranteed annual income. I'm sure you've thought about that as a potential response. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts. I'm also interested in the possibility that such a policy might actually increase semi-unemployment or underemployment, as it would provide a mechanism whereby employers could hire people more on a more temporary basis.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure some of you or many of you would share the opinion that with basic income or whatever the name you want to use for it, guaranteed annual income, the devil's in the details. Really, does this mean further clawing and breaking up of other universal programs? I can only imagine the right wing, wanting to, I can only imagine. You can see what the pushback will be. Okay, we've got guaranteed annual income here, so we don't need EI, for example. That's just one thing. We don't need disability, sick leave, and I could imagine it being used by employers as a subsidy, much like what you're just talking about. So I think, in principle, it's an exciting and interesting. There's exciting and interesting potential, and as you probably know, it's being tested right now in Ontario. But I think no single thing is the silver bullet here, and I think the sooner we stop looking for a silver bullet and start actually building a stronger floor upon which all workers can stand, we're going to be stuck here.
That's a question.
Okay.
You closed by saying that unions need to look at new alliances and new ways of serving the working class. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on any possible ideas you might have for what unions can do in that regard.
Well, for most unions, and I sort of mentioned this already, their organizing model is predicated on this, on their being an employer, and their being employees. And the way it's, they're generally able to organize is those employees have to be in a place. So if those scenarios aren't there, but unions have, capacity, they have resources, they have, the policy underpinning and the organizational experience, I mean, there's huge opportunities just because of that to find ways of, I can just speak personally. We have support from various unions for the work that we're doing, and I think one of the reasons for that is because labor sees that they need to look beyond their membership for new ways to support workers. So it's going to be harder for a union to organize a bargaining unit of, I don't know, people that work for skip the dishes, right? Because where are they? How do we find them? And then secondly, how do they pay dues? And who's the employer that we're going to bargain with? But I think because unions have this institutional knowledge and experience and some physical capacity and resources, I think we are going to see, and I think we are going to see some innovative thinking from the labor movement, and also, we've seen already with, for example, Uber drivers in New York, how labor worked really creatively to make that happen. We also see how labor has played a major role in raising the minimum wage in certain jurisdictions in the United States. Not just through their own bargaining units, but actually working as part of a mass movement, and in fact, putting their resources and their own capacity into a broader objective, which isn't just defined by their own union membership, but the broader good of all workers. And I think those are exciting new ways for labor as we move forward. But I think as well, we have all these misclassified workers out there. We have a lot of workers who are actually probably legally employees of companies. And I think that, you know, that's going to be another way for labor that'll be another way I think that labor can activate in this space, because we have employers and that are playing fast and loose with the rules around classification. Does that answer your question, sort of? Or yeah, okay, all right.
We have a question over here. Yeah, I just as a little note, interestingly, at the University of Alberta, we've been rewriting the bylaws for our new union. We're now unionized, and struggling to include the precariat in the bylaws, and it's difficult. But there was from a values standpoint, it was important for us to ensure that they were there.
Yeah, great.
I guess I'd like to broaden the issue quite a bit. I've been thinking, I have 5 grandchildren, I'm a retired teacher. And so the young are very special to me. And I've been thinking about what is work? Why do we do it? And I've been thinking about work that we should stop doing, like making junk for the landfill. We likely have to stop doing that. We should stop doing that. But is anybody thinking about the work that needs doing, given the reality of climate change, given the reality of a growing population, that we expand what work means and why we do it? Because a lot of the work we're doing right now, like skip the dishes, there's a deeper story there. The people ordering that food are young families who can't actually afford to go out for a meal when they're too tired to cook. And they're ordering from places like fucking McDonald's and paying $40 for junk food. So it's not just the person bringing it. The whole system is kind of anti-life and destructive. So where are the movements to rethink what needs doing, how we get it done as a society? And because I think there's all kinds of work that needs doing if we're going to preserve our ecosphere, build cities that are resilient. Who's going to do that work? Who's going to pay for that work? How are we going to move our young people into meaningful lives? Because a lot of this stuff, apart from the fact that it doesn't pay enough, seems like pointless shit work too. Pushing paper around, eh? Building graphic designs for what? Something to sell something that nobody really needs. So that's my question. Could we change what it is we do on this planet?
Well, I always like the simple questions. I'm just going to take one little piece of what you're talking about, because I mean, broadly, we're in agreement around the way we've ordered things, especially when we think about climate change, is just absolutely in the opposite direction to where it needs to go. But one part that I feel I could speak to is just, it's true that we have an idea about what work is, and that idea about what work is largely been informed by 70 years of work and the way we work since the Depression and the building of the welfare state, and as we I hope I've shown today, like the idea of full-time work is evaporating, and we can and should push back against the egregious ways in which workers are being exploited, but it may be just that with technology going the way it's going, that many jobs are evaporating, and globalization has put us in competition with low-wage jurisdictions around the world for jobs which used to have been fairly stable and safe here, including engineering jobs and vast array of new economy jobs. So what we maybe need to start thinking about is exactly part of your question: what is work, and does it have to be a 9-to-5 thing? Does it have to be predicated on the sort of ideas that we've had up until now? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think these are the questions we do need to start asking ourselves, because I don't think the only answer is a full-time job. I don't think that's the only answer out there. And as I said earlier, I don't think there is a silver bullet for any of this stuff.
Yes, you mentioned that about 80% of the college profs in Ontario are contract, and I assume it's probably the same throughout Canada, similar. So I'm just wondering, without a steady university job, and therefore presumably without tenure, has this had a chilling effect on the will, as far as you've been able to tell or looked into, on the willingness of profs to engage in activist or controversial work, or even to undertake research that might be a potential threat to the powers that be? Have you noticed anything like that?
Well, I think it maybe is having the opposite effect. I think that as this situation just becomes more blatant, I mean, this is the longest college strike in Ontario's history, and I think that's the reason. I think that's the reason, you know.
I mean, in terms of just general work in the economy or politically controversial topics, you know, investigating, say, neoliberalism itself outside their own personal work environment, is there a reluctance to do that in case, even if they're a prof, they may, without tenure, there's, you know, a chance that they may be dismissed?
Well, that raises huge questions around, you know, around academic freedom within the context of a contingent workforce in academia. That's a huge question. So I can't really answer your question, but I do know that there are folks out there who have decided to either leave that profession because of the instability there, or to simply not go into it at all. So there's that, as well as the issues of academic freedom.
Yes, we've just had a terrible example this week of academic freedom being stymied at Wilfrid Laurier University. And anyway, I won't go on. Some of you may know about this, but...
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to...
just
there?
that a young professor was chastised for trying to create a debate in her classroom. And to your question, I just wonder to what extent a young academic who doesn't have tenure would be reluctant to, for example, do anything that might be considered controversial in the class if she's now being monitored. People are coming into her class, watching her. This is all over the news. It's all over Google. I don't want to take any more time, but just in response.
Okay. Two things. One is a writer called Muhammad Yunus, who is trying to change the world economy from constant profit. And that's the end of that one. Simpson Sears were stacking money away in the States from their profits. They paid their directors very handsomely. And they were told that there'd be no pensions. Were these people employees who had actually paid into the pensions, and why did they have no right to at least what they had been paying in?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm sure there are others who know the full minutia of this debacle, this outrage, but it is outrageous that there was an underfunded a pension deficit of about $250 million, and when the company was making huge profits. Those profits were dividended out, and they didn't pay the pension liability. And so when they went to bankruptcy, it's an old story. It's happened too many times in Canada, and again, until we find a way to mobilize around this and bring in federal legislation that ensures that the first people at the table in a bankruptcy are the workers, that's what needs to happen.
Well, I think with that, we will end this. But I can just see from the audience that you've kind of whipped everybody up here about work, the nature of work, the future of work, and what it looks like, and just our values as a country around work and the workers and valuing them. So, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And on behalf of the Parkland,
All right.
I have this to present to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having a listen. Thanks.